She stood on the tarmac, watching someone else climb into her cockpit. 7 months of training, hundreds of hours in that Apache. And then, minutes before the most important flight of her career, they pulled her. No explanation, no appeal. Just a quiet order in front of 40 pilots and a room full of visiting brass. The whispers started immediately. Psych eval. Insubordination. Command doesn't trust her. But when a 4-star admiral arrived unannounced and asked one simple question, everything they thought they knew was about to shatter. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories of quiet courage and unseen sacrifice, consider subscribing. What happened next would expose a truth no one was prepared to hear. The desert sun had barely cleared the horizon when Captain Lyric Castellane pushed through the double doors of the pre-flight briefing room at Falcon Ridge Air Station. The air inside was thick with tension and the smell of burnt coffee. Pilots stood in clusters around the flight roster board, checking assignments for Exercise Sentinel Forge. This was the kind of event that could define a career. NATO observers, Pentagon brass, live fire demonstrations broadcast to Allied command centers across 3 continents. Everyone knew what was at stake. Lyric moved through the room with the kind of economy that came from years of discipline. She was 31, lean and compact, with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything without lingering on anything. The other pilots noticed her, but didn't engage. A few nodded, most looked away. There was a distance around her that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't warmth either. It was the kind of space people left around someone they weren't sure how to read. She stopped at the roster board and scanned the names. Apache 6-1, lead gunship for the close air support demonstration. Her name was printed next to it in crisp black letters. 7 months of preparation had led to this moment. 7 months of simulator runs, live fire drills, coordination briefings with ground controllers, and endless equipment checks. She had flown that bird more than anyone else on the base. She knew its quirks, its strengths, the way it pulls slightly left during hard banks. It was hers in every way that mattered except on paper. She turned to head toward the equipment lockers when a voice cut through the low murmur of conversation. Castellane, Major Bridger Talmadge, stood in the doorway to the operations office. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of stone and left in the sun too long. He didn't meet her eyes. Lyric stopped. "Sir, need a word, outside." The room didn't go silent, but the quality of the noise changed. Conversations continued, but everyone was listening now. Lyric could feel it. She followed Talmadge into the hallway. He walked a few paces away from the door, then stopped and crossed his arms. Still, wouldn't look at her. "You're scratched," he said. Lyric stared at him. "What?" "Not cleared for flight. Effective immediately." "On whose authority?" "Command decision." His jaw was tight. "Don't push it." "Major, I've been prepping for this sortie for 7 months. My pre-flight checks are done. The bird is ready. I'm ready." "Not my call, Castellane." "Then whose call is it?" Talmadge finally looked at her. There was something in his expression that might have been sympathy, but it was buried under layers of rigid professionalism. "Colonel Kellerman, and before you ask, no, I don't know why. Orders came down an hour ago. You're off the roster." Lyric felt something cold settle in her chest. "Who's taking my slot?" "Lieutenant Oakes." Sable Oakes, a decent pilot, competent. But she had less than half of Lyric's flight hours and had never flown a live fire demonstration of this scale. Lyric didn't say any of that. She just nodded once, slowly. "Understood, sir." Talmadge looked like he wanted to say something else. Instead, he turned and walked back into the briefing room. Lyric stood alone in the hallway for a moment, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. Then she followed him back inside. The briefing started 5 minutes later. Colonel Rhett Kellerman stood at the front of the room, a wiry man with silver hair and a voice like gravel. He went through the mission parameters with mechanical precision: weather conditions, flight paths, target zones, rules of engagement. When he got to the aircraft assignments, he paused. "Change to the roster," he said. "Apache 6-1 will be flown by Lieutenant Oakes. Captain Castellane is reassigned to ground observation." 40 pairs of eyes turned toward Lyric. She sat in the 3rd row, back straight, face expressionless. Ground observation. It was the kind of assignment you gave to students or pilots under disciplinary review. It meant standing in the tower with binoculars while everyone else did the actual work. Kellerman didn't offer an explanation. He just moved on to the next item on the agenda. But the room had changed. Whispers started, low and insistent. Lyric could feel them like static electricity on her skin. When the briefing ended, she stood and walked out without looking at anyone. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, just moved through the room like water finding the path of least resistance. Behind her, the whispers grew louder. In the hallway, 2 junior pilots stood near the water fountain. Lieutenant Gareth, a tall kid from Montana with a sunburned neck, and Lieutenant Inez, a sharp-eyed woman from New Jersey who flew transport choppers. They didn't notice Lyric approaching until she was almost past them. "Heard she got flagged during psych eval," Gareth said. "I heard she refused a direct order in Qatar," Inez replied. "Whatever it was, command doesn't trust her." Lyric kept walking. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't break stride, didn't turn around, just kept moving until she reached the exit and stepped out into the brutal desert heat. The tarmac shimmered under the morning sun. Rows of Apache helicopters sat in perfect formation, their rotors casting long shadows across the concrete. Ground crews moved between them, running final checks, loading ordnance, verifying systems. In the distance, the VIP area was being set up. Chairs and awnings for the NATO observers and Pentagon officials who would be watching the demonstration. Cameras were being positioned, sound equipment tested. This wasn't just a training exercise, it was a performance. Lyric made her way to the command tower, a squat concrete structure with a 360-degree view of the airfield. Inside, the observation deck was crowded with officers and technicians. She found a spot near the windows, away from the main clusters of personnel. Someone handed her a pair of binoculars. She took them without comment. Below, on the tarmac, Sable Oaks was doing her pre-flight walk-around on Apache 6-1. Lyric watched through the binoculars. Sable was thorough, she'd give her that. She checked the rotor blades, inspected the landing gear, examined the weapons pylons. But there was a hesitation in her movements, a lack of fluidity. She had to refer to her checklist 3 times for things Lyric could do from memory. The crew chief, a grizzled warrant officer named Decker, stood nearby with his arms crossed. Lyric had worked with Decker for 2 years. He was old-school air cavalry, a Vietnam-era mechanic who'd seen more combat from the ground than most pilots saw from the air. He didn't suffer incompetence, and he didn't hide his opinions. Right now, he looked profoundly unhappy. Sable climbed into the cockpit and started running through the systems checks. Lyric lowered the binoculars and looked away. She didn't need to watch this. On the far side of the observation deck, 2 senior officers stood near the radio console. Lieutenant Colonel Ren Ferris, a slim woman with steel-gray hair and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, and Major Quinn DeSoto, a former Apache pilot who'd moved into command roles after a crash left him with a permanent limp. They were speaking in low voices, but the observation deck wasn't large. Sound carried. "This is a mistake," DeSoto said. "It's done," Ferris replied. "We can't second-guess it now. Oaks isn't ready for this. You know that. I know that. Kellerman knows that. It doesn't matter. It matters to the mission." Ferris turned to look at him. "The mission will proceed as planned. Oaks is capable. She'll be fine." "And if she's not?" Ferris didn't answer. She just looked out at the tarmac, her expression unreadable. Lyric stood near the window, staring at nothing. She could feel eyes on her. People were watching, wondering, judging. She'd been through this before, the scrutiny, the doubt. The quiet assumption that if someone in command didn't trust her, there must be a reason. It didn't matter that no one would say what that reason was. The absence of an explanation was its own kind of evidence. She thought about the last 7 months, the hours in the simulator, the coordination drills, the briefings where she'd walked the entire squadron through the mission profile, step by step, until everyone knew their role by heart. She'd done everything right. She'd been perfect. And it hadn't mattered. The radio crackled to life. "Tower, this is Apache 6-1, pre-flight complete, requesting clearance for engine start." The tower controller glanced at the mission clock. 6-1, you're cleared. Stand by for coordination check." Lyric watched through the window as the Apache's rotors began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, until they were a blur against the pale sky. The sound was a low thrum that vibrated through the observation deck's reinforced glass. Then, the radio crackled again. Sable's voice, tighter this time. "Tower, 6-1. I'm showing a hydraulic pressure anomaly on the primary system. Need guidance." The observation deck went still. Every head turned toward the windows. On the tarmac, Decker was already moving toward the Apache, a diagnostics tablet in his hand. Ferris stepped up to the radio console. 6-1, describe the anomaly. Pressure reading is fluctuating. It's within tolerance, but it's not stable. DeSoto swore under his breath. Ferris shot him a look. 6-1, stand by. Do not proceed with engine run-up. Ground crew is en route. Lyric raised the binoculars again. She could see Decker climbing up to the cockpit, leaning in to talk to Sable. He was pointing at something on the instrument panel. Sable was shaking her head. Decker pointed again, more emphatically this time. The mission clock showed 18 minutes until scheduled takeoff. In the VIP area, NATO observers were starting to arrive. Pentagon officials in dress uniforms, foreign military attachés, people who'd flown halfway around the world to watch this demonstration. Lyric scanned the hydraulic system through the binoculars. She could see the reservoir access panel from here. The angle was wrong, but she knew that bird. She'd spent 200 hours in that cockpit. She could picture the system layout in her mind, and she could see what the problem was. The hydraulic reservoir hadn't been fully pressurized during ground prep. It wasn't a mechanical fault. It was human error, a simple mistake that a rookie crew chief might make. Except Decker wasn't a rookie, which meant someone else had touched that system after his final checks. Or the pressurization had been deliberately skipped. Lyric lowered the binoculars. Her hand moved toward the radio console, then stopped. If she called this in, if she corrected the problem from here, it would look like interference, like she was trying to sabotage Oaks, like she was proving everything the whispers said about her, that she was unstable, unreliable, a liability. She set the binoculars down on the console and stepped back. On the tarmac, Decker was still arguing with Sable. The mission clock ticked down. 17 minutes. Ferris keyed the radio. 6-1, status update. Still diagnosing, ma'am. Crew chief is running a full systems check. How long? Unknown at this time. Ferris turned to DeSoto. Get me Kellerman, now. DeSoto pulled out his phone and walked toward the far corner of the observation deck. Lyric watched him go. Then she looked back out at the tarmac. That's when she saw it. A black Suburban rolling through the main gate. No escort, no advance notice. It moved across the airfield with the kind of authority that didn't need permission. The base security didn't even slow it down. They just waved it through. Lyric felt something shift in her chest. She knew that vehicle, or rather, she knew what it meant. The Suburban stopped near the command tower. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out into the harsh sunlight. He was tall, probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons that caught the light like a constellation. 4 stars on his collar. Dress whites so crisp they looked like they could cut glass. Admiral Cato Renfield. Lyric's hands tightened on the edge of the console. Across the observation deck, someone gasped. Ferris turned toward the window, her face going pale. DeSoto, still on the phone, froze mid-sentence. Colonel Kellerman came running out of the operations building like a man who'd just been told his house was on fire. He crossed the tarmac at a near jog, straightening his uniform as he went. Renfield waited, hands clasped behind his back, watching the chaos around the grounded Apache with an expression of clinical detachment. The two men met near the VIP area. Kellerman saluted. Renfield returned it with the bare minimum of effort. Then Kellerman started talking, fast and urgent. Lyric couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. Kellerman was explaining, justifying. Renfield listened without moving, without reacting, his face a mask of perfect neutrality. Then Renfield said something. Short. Quiet. Kellerman stopped talking. He looked like he'd been slapped. Renfield turned and started walking toward the command tower, toward Lyric. Ferris stepped away from the radio console, smoothing her uniform. DeSoto ended his phone call and stood at attention. The other officers in the observation deck shifted uncomfortably, like students who'd just realized the principal was coming to their classroom. The door to the observation deck opened. Admiral Renfield stepped inside. The room snapped to attention as one. As you were, Renfield said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. He scanned the room, his gaze moving from face to face, until it landed on Lyric. "Captain Castellane." Lyric straightened. "Sir, walk with me." He didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked back out onto the exterior observation platform. Lyric followed, aware of every eye in the room tracking her movement. Outside, the heat was oppressive. The observation platform overlooked the entire airfield. Apaches lined up in formation, ground crews scrambling around the disabled 6-1, VIP observers starting to murmur. In the distance, the desert stretched out forever, pale and merciless. Renfield stood at the railing, looking out at the scene below. He didn't speak for a long moment, just watched. Lyric stood beside him, waiting. Finally, he broke the silence. "Who grounded you?" "Major Talmadge, sir, on orders from Colonel Kellerman." "Did they give you a reason?" "No, sir." "Did you ask for one?" "No, sir." Renfield glanced at her. "Why not?" Lyric looked out at the tarmac, at the Apache she'd trained on, at the pilots who'd whispered about her, at the officers who'd pulled her without explanation. "Because I already know why," she said. Renfield studied her for a moment. Then he nodded, just once, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. He turned and walked back into the observation deck. Lyric followed. Inside, Renfield moved directly to the radio console. Ferris stepped aside. DeSoto backed up. Renfield picked up the handset and keyed the transmit button. "All stations, this is Admiral Renfield. I am assuming operational authority over Exercise Sentinel Forge effective immediately." The channel crackled. Somewhere on the flight line, someone dropped a tool. The sound echoed across the tarmac. "I want Colonel Kellerman, Major Talmadge, and Lieutenant Colonel Ferris in the command tower. Now." Renfield set down the handset. The observation deck was silent. No one moved, no one breathed. Ferris cleared her throat. "Sir, I'm already here." Renfield looked at her. "Then you can wait." 3 minutes later, Kellerman and Talmadge arrived. They stood in a line near the radio console, backs rigid, faces carefully blank. Renfield looked at each of them in turn. "Explain to me," he said, his voice perfectly calm, "why Captain Castellane was removed from the flight roster." Kellerman opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Sir, it was a command decision based on operational security concerns." "What concerns?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, sir." "You're not at liberty." Renfield's tone didn't change, but something in the room shifted. "Colonel, I have oversight authority for every classified operation run out of this base for the last 18 months. If there are operational security concerns regarding Captain Castellane, I would know about them. So I'll ask again. What concerns?" Kellerman's jaw worked. "Sir, with respect, the decision was made in consultation with intelligence oversight." "Which division?" Silence. Renfield waited. The observation deck felt like it was holding its breath. Finally, Ferris spoke up. "Sir, the concern was that Captain Castellane's presence in a high-profile exercise might raise questions we're not prepared to answer." "Questions about what?" Ferris glanced at Kellerman. He gave a tiny shake of his head. She looked back at Renfield. "About her recent operational history, sir." Renfield's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went very cold. "I see," he said. He turned to Lyric. "Captain, have you been informed of any restrictions on your flight status?" "No, sir." "Have you been notified of any pending investigations or disciplinary actions?" "No, sir." "Are you currently qualified to fly the AH-64 Apache?" "Yes, sir." Renfield turned back to Kellerman. "Colonel, unless you can provide me with documented evidence of a legitimate safety or security concern within the next 60 seconds, Captain Castellane will be reinstated to full flight status. Your choice." Kellerman looked like a man watching his career burn. "Sir, I must protest." "Protest noted. 60 seconds, starting now." No one spoke. The mission clock on the wall ticked down. 55 seconds. 50. 45. Kellerman's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't speak. 30 seconds. 25. 20. Ferris looked at the floor. Talmadge stared straight ahead, his face carved from stone. 10 seconds. 5. Renfield picked up the radio handset again. This time, he switched it to the base-wide channel. Every radio on Falcon Ridge Air Station would hear what he said next. Every pilot, every crew chief, every officer, every observer in the VIP area. If you've ever witnessed someone prove the doubters wrong, share this story. And if you believe in recognizing those who serve in silence, consider subscribing. What Admiral Renfield said next would echo across that airbase for years to come. Admiral Renfield's voice cut through the static on every radio across Falcon Ridge Air Station. Clear, measured, impossible to ignore. "Captain Castellane, front and center." The words hung in the desert air like a suspended sentence. On the observation deck, every officer turned to look at Lyric. Down on the tarmac, ground crews stopped mid-task. In the VIP area, NATO observers leaned forward in their seats. The entire airbase had gone silent, waiting. Lyric met Renfield's eyes. He gave her a single nod. She walked out of the observation deck, down the metal stairs, and onto the burning tarmac. The sun was climbing higher now, turning the concrete into a griddle. Heat waves shimmered between the rows of Apaches. Her boots made sharp sounds against the pavement, each step echoing in the unnatural quiet. 40 pilots lined the edge of the flight line, watching. Sable Oaks stood frozen beside Apache 6-1, her helmet tucked under one arm. Decker, the crew chief, had stopped his diagnostics and was staring at the command tower with an expression somewhere between shock and vindication. Lyric crossed the distance between the tower and the Admiral's position. 200 yards. It felt like 2 miles. She could feel the weight of every stare, every unspoken question, every judgment that had followed her for weeks. She stopped 3 paces from Admiral Renfield and came to attention. Renfield didn't move, didn't speak. He just looked at her, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to contract down to the space between them. Then he keyed the radio again, his thumb pressing the transmit button with deliberate precision. What he said next would be heard by everyone. The tower, the flight line, the VIP observers, the visiting brass, every single person on Falcon Ridge Air Station. 14 weeks ago, Renfield began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of command. Captain Castellane flew a classified interdiction mission in the Qatar Basin. Hostile territory, 0 aerial support, complete radio blackout. The silence deepened. Lyric's face remained impassive, but something flickered behind her eyes. Renfield continued. Her Apache took sustained fire from 3 positions: ground-based anti-aircraft, small arms, RPG fire. She neutralized all targets, extracted a pinned reconnaissance team under direct fire, and returned the aircraft to base with 11% fuel remaining and critical damage to both engines. On the flight line, Gareth and Inez exchanged stunned looks. Sable's face had gone pale. In the VIP area, a British colonel sat forward, his expression shifting from mild interest to sharp attention. The mission was deemed too sensitive to acknowledge, Renfield said. Her record was scrubbed. She was told to resume normal duties and say nothing. No medal, no commendation, no public record. He paused. The pause stretched out, filling every corner of the airbase with expectation. She flew the classified run. 5 words. They landed like artillery fire. Lyric stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere past Renfield's shoulder, but her hands hanging at her sides had curled into fists. The reaction rippled outward from those 5 words like a shockwave. Sable took a half step backward, as if physically pushed. Decker's weathered face split into something that wasn't quite a smile, but held all the satisfaction of a man whose instincts had just been proven right. In the observation deck, visible through the tower windows, Lieutenant Colonel Ferris had turned away from the glass, her shoulders rigid. Gareth broke the silence first, his voice barely a whisper, but loud enough to carry in the stillness. Holy God! Inez didn't say anything. She just stared at Lyric with an expression that had gone from skepticism to something approaching awe in the span of 5 seconds. In the VIP area, conversations erupted in low, urgent tones. The NATO observers were conferring. The Pentagon officials were already pulling out phones, making calls, demanding context. This wasn't just a demonstration anymore. This was a revelation. Renfield turned to face Lyric directly now, no longer broadcasting, but speaking just to her. His voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. You were grounded because someone in this chain of command thought your presence here would raise questions. They sacrificed your career to protect a classification. Lyric met his eyes. Sir, I understood the requirements. Understanding and agreeing are different things, Captain. I signed the non-disclosure, sir. And they used it as a gag order. Renfield's tone was flat, factual, but there was an edge underneath. That ends now. He turned toward Apache 6-1 and raised his voice again, not to broadcast level, but loud enough for everyone on the immediate flight line to hear. Get in the cockpit, Captain. For the first time since the grounding, Lyric hesitated, not from doubt, from the sheer weight of what was happening. Everything she'd been told to bury, to forget, to carry in silence, was suddenly being dragged into daylight. The cost of that exposure was still unknown. From the observation deck, Colonel Kellerman's voice crackled over the radio. Desperate, controlled panic barely held in check. Sir, the mission is still classified. We can't just... Renfield cut him off with a single gesture, keying the radio with the kind of finality that ended arguments. And she's still the best pilot on this base, Colonel. Unless you'd like to tell our NATO allies why we benched her in favor of someone who can't pressurize a hydraulic system. The words hit like a slap. On the tarmac, Decker made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Sable's face flushed red, but she didn't move, didn't protest. She knew, everyone knew. Renfield's voice dropped back to command tone. Captain Castellane, you are cleared for flight. That's an order. Lyric's hesitation lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then she moved. She crossed to Apache 6-1, with the kind of purpose that came from muscle memory. Sable stepped aside without a word, extending the helmet. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Sable's expression was complicated. Shame, relief, something else Lyric couldn't quite identify. Ma'am, Sable said quietly. I didn't know. Lyric took the helmet. You weren't supposed to. I'm sorry. Don't be. You would have done fine. It was a kindness Lyric didn't have to offer, and they both knew it. Sable nodded, stepping back to join the other pilots lining the flight path. Lyric climbed into the cockpit. The seat conformed to her like it had been waiting. Her hands moved across the controls with the kind of precision that couldn't be taught, only earned through hundreds of hours and the kind of pressure that turned training into instinct. Decker appeared at the side of the cockpit, helping with the harness. His hands were steady, professional, but when he leaned in to check the shoulder straps, he spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear. Heard what you did, ma'am. Whole flight line's heard by now. Lyric glanced at him. Decker, it's still classified. Decker's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. Not anymore, it isn't. He stepped back, giving her space to complete the pre-flight sequence. Lyric's hands moved across the instrument panel, checking readouts, verifying. Systems, running through the startup checklist, with a speed that would have looked reckless if it weren't so clearly controlled. She found the hydraulic issue in under 30 seconds. The reservoir pressure was low, exactly as she'd suspected from the observation deck. Not a mechanical fault, not sabotage, just an incomplete pressurization during ground prep. She corrected it with 3 precise adjustments, then signaled to Decker. He checked her work, nodded, and gave her a thumbs up. The tower crackled to life. A new voice now. Not the regular controller, Admiral Renfield himself. Apache 6-1, you are cleared for engine start. Mission profile unchanged. Execute at your discretion. Lyric keyed her radio. 6-1, Roger. Beginning engine start sequence. The turbines spooled up with a rising whine that built into a roar. The rotors began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, cutting the air with a sound that was both mechanical and organic, like the breathing of some enormous predator. The entire flight line watched, not just the pilots, everyone, ground crews, tower personnel, the NATO observers in their pressed uniforms, the Pentagon officials with their phones and their questions. Even the base security personnel had stopped their patrols to stare. Lyric completed the engine run-up, verified all systems green, and keyed the radio again. Tower 6-1, pre-flight complete. Request clearance for departure. 6-1, you are cleared. Flight path Alpha, weapons hot at range marker. Good hunting, Captain. The Apache lifted off the tarmac with the kind of smoothness that made it look easy. Lyric banked slightly, adjusting for the crosswind that always kicked up in the late morning, and accelerated toward the designated flight path. In the observation deck, DeSoto watched through binoculars, his expression unreadable. Ferris stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, face carefully neutral, Kellerman had disappeared entirely, presumably to make phone calls to people who were about to be very unhappy with him. On the flight line, Gareth turned to Inez. "Did you see how fast she ran that pre-flight?" Inez nodded slowly. "That's not fast, that's automatic. That's someone who doesn't have to think about it anymore." "How many hours does that take?" "More than we have," Inez said quietly. The Apache moved into the live fire range, a stretch of desert marked with target arrays and sensor equipment. The exercise parameters called for a simulated close air support run. Ground targets, suppression of enemy air defenses, precision strikes on designated objectives. It was meant to showcase coordination, accuracy, and decision-making under pressure. Lyric executed the entire sequence in 12 minutes. The first pass was a textbook SED run, suppression of enemy air defenses. She identified the simulated SAM sites, prioritized targets based on threat level, and engaged with a combination of Hellfire missiles and 30mm cannon fire that left nothing but smoke, markers where the targets had been. The second pass was close air support, simulated friendly forces pinned down by hostile fire. She came in low and fast, using terrain masking to avoid theoretical anti-aircraft fire, and delivered precision strikes on the designated enemy positions with a margin of error measured in inches, not feet. The third pass was pure demonstration, a high-speed gun run that showcased the Apache's agility and the pilot's ability to maintain accuracy under dynamic conditions. Lyric put every round within the target zone while executing evasive maneuvers that would have been aggressive even in actual combat. In the VIP area, the British colonel was taking notes. A French general was speaking rapidly into a phone. The Pentagon officials had stopped making calls and were just watching now, silent and focused. When Lyric brought the Apache back around for landing, the applause started. Not loud, not wild. Just a steady, respectful acknowledgement from the observers who understood exactly what they had just witnessed. She set the bird down with the kind of precision that made it look like the landing gear had been magnetically pulled to specific marks on the tarmac. The rotors spun down. The turbines wound into silence. The dust settled. Lyric went through the shutdown checklist with the same methodical care she'd used for the startup. Every switch, every gauge, every system verified and secured. When she finally removed her helmet and climbed out of the cockpit, the tarmac was lined with pilots. They weren't cheering, weren't calling out. They were just there, standing, watching. A silent presence that said more than words could have. Sable was the first to approach. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in the last hour. "Ma'am, I didn't know. I should have, but I didn't." Lyric pulled off her gloves. "You flew what you were assigned to fly. No shame in that. But you did my job, same as you would have done." Lyric's voice was firm, but not unkind. "The mission succeeded. That's what matters." Sable nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She stepped back, joining the other pilots. Decker was waiting by the Apache, running his post-flight inspection. When Lyric walked over, he didn't look up from his clipboard. "Bird performed perfectly, ma'am. No issues to report." "She always does when you prep her, Decker. Helps to have a pilot who knows what she's doing." He glanced up, meeting her eyes. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I never believed the whispers." "What made you so sure?" Decker gestured at the Apache. "Because I see how you treat the equipment, how you talk to the crews, how you move through pre-flight. You can fake a lot of things, ma'am, but you can't fake that kind of respect for the machine. Only comes from someone who's been in the fire and knows what it costs when things go wrong." Lyric felt something tighten in her chest. She nodded once. "Thank you, Decker." "Just stating facts, ma'am." She left him to his inspection and headed toward the command tower. She needed to debrief, to file her after-action report, to face whatever administrative consequences were about to come crashing down for the public revelation of a classified mission. But before she reached the tower, a voice stopped her. "Captain." Admiral Renfield stood near the base of the stairs, hands clasped behind his back. The VIP observers were still in the background, but he'd separated himself from them. Lyric came to attention. "Sir, walk with me." They moved away from the tower, toward a section of tarmac that was temporarily clear. Renfield didn't speak immediately. He just walked, and Lyric matched his pace. Finally, he broke the silence. "You know what happens now?" "Yes, sir. Inquiries, reviews, probably a formal investigation into the disclosure." All of which will conclude that I made the call, not you. You followed orders, nothing more. Lyric glanced at him. Sir, with respect, they'll still come after me. Operational security. Unauthorized disclosure. Even if I was following orders, they'll find a way to make it my fault. Renfield stopped walking. He turned to face her directly. Let them try. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. This was a 4-star admiral with 3 decades of service and connections that reached into every corner of the Department of Defense. If he was willing to shield her, very few people would be able to touch her. But there was a cost to that protection. There always was. Sir, why did you come here today? Renfield studied her for a moment. Because I was at the debrief for the Qatar Basin operation. I read the after-action reports. I saw the gun camera footage. I know what you did out there, and I know what it cost you to stay silent about it. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I also know that the order to scrub your record came from people more concerned with political optics than operational reality. They didn't want questions about why we were running interdiction missions in that region, so they buried the mission, and they buried you with it. Lyric's jaw tightened. She didn't respond. When I heard you'd been pulled from this exercise, Renfield continued, I made some calls, found out it was the same people, same reasoning. They didn't want your presence here raising questions they'd have to answer, so they sacrificed you, again. Sir, I knew the cost when I took the mission. Knowing the cost and accepting injustice are 2 different things, Captain. Renfield's voice was quiet but firm. You did your job. You did it brilliantly, and you were punished for it. That ends today. Lyric met his eyes. Even if it means exposing the operation was successfully completed 14 weeks ago. The intelligence objectives were met. The only thing classification was protecting at this point was institutional embarrassment. He gestured toward the VIP area. And now every allied observer on this base knows we have a pilot who can execute that kind of mission. That's not a security risk. That's a strategic asset. He let that sink in for a moment. You're reinstated, Captain. Full flight status, no restrictions, and if anyone in your chain of command has a problem with that, they can take it up with me personally. Lyric wanted to say something. Thank you felt insufficient. So did any other response she could think of. So she just nodded. Renfield returned the nod. Dismissed, Captain. Go file your report. Lyric saluted. Renfield returned it with the kind of precision that said more than words. Then he turned and walked back toward the VIP area, leaving her standing alone on the tarmac. She stood there for a moment, feeling the desert heat on her skin, the weight of the helmet bag in her hand, the reality of what had just happened settling over her like a physical thing. She flew the classified run, and now everyone knew. The observation deck was nearly empty when she climbed the stairs. Most of the officers had dispersed, probably to make calls, file reports, cover their tracks. Only DeSoto remained, standing near the windows, looking out at the flight line. He turned when she entered. Hell of a flight, Captain. Thank you, sir. I owe you an apology. I should have pushed back harder when they pulled you. I knew it was wrong. Lyric set her helmet bag on the table. You were following orders, sir, same as everyone else. Following orders isn't always the same as doing what's right. DeSoto's expression was troubled. I flew Apaches for 15 years. I know what it takes to execute a mission like the one Renfield described, and I know what it costs to keep that kind of thing quiet. He paused, measuring his next words. For what it's worth, you have my respect, and my support. If they come after you for this, you won't be standing alone. Lyric felt something shift inside her, not relief, not vindication, just a small, quiet acknowledgement that maybe, finally, someone understood. I appreciate that, sir. DeSoto nodded and left. Lyric was alone in the observation deck now. She moved to the windows and looked out at the flight line. The Apaches sat in their rows, rotors still, waiting for the next mission. Ground crews moved between them, performing maintenance, checking systems, preparing for whatever came next. It looked like any other day on any other base, but it wasn't. Everything had changed. The silence that had protected her had been shattered. The classification that had buried her record was now public knowledge, at least among the people who mattered. The whispers that had followed her for weeks were being replaced by something else. She wasn't sure yet if that something else was better. Her radio crackled. A message from the admin building. Colonel Kellerman wanted to see her. Immediately. Lyric picked up her helmet bag and headed for the door. As she walked down the stairs, she passed Gareth and Inez in the hallway. They both straightened when they saw her. Gareth spoke first. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. The things I said earlier, the assumptions I made, they were wrong. Completely wrong." Inez nodded. "We both were. We're sorry." Lyric stopped. She could have kept walking, could have let them stew in their guilt, but that wasn't who she was. "You didn't know," she said simply, "and you weren't supposed to. Apology accepted. Now get back to work." They both nodded, relief visible on their faces. As Lyric continued down the hall, she heard Inez whisper to Gareth, "She just saved our careers and apologized to us. How does that work?" Lyric didn't hear Gareth's response. She was already out the door, heading across the compound toward Kellerman's office. The admin building was cooler inside, air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the desert heat. Lyric made her way to the commander's office on the second floor. The door was open. Kellerman sat behind his desk, looking like a man who just watched his entire career strategy collapse. He gestured to a chair. "Sit." Lyric sat. Kellerman stared at her for a long moment. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I followed a direct order from a superior officer, sir." "You exposed a classified operation." "Admiral Renfield exposed the operation, sir. I was just standing there." Kellerman's jaw worked. "Don't play games with me, Captain. You knew what that revelation would mean. You knew the consequences." "With respect, sir, I knew the consequences of staying silent. I lived with them for 14 weeks. I watched my career get buried, watched my reputation get destroyed. Stood by while you pulled me from the one thing I'd worked toward for 7 months, all to protect a classification that was protecting nothing but institutional cowardice." The words came out harder than she'd intended. Kellerman's face flushed red. "You are out of line, Captain." "Then file a complaint, sir. Add it to whatever else you're planning to throw at me." Kellerman stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced to the window, staring out at the airfield. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, tired. "I didn't want to ground you. I want you to know that. The order came from above my pay grade, people who were more worried about congressional hearings than operational readiness. And you followed it. Yes, I followed it, because that's what officers do. We follow orders, even when we don't agree with them. Even when those orders are wrong." Kellerman turned to face her. "Especially then, because the alternative is chaos. The alternative is every officer making their own decisions about what orders to follow and which ones to ignore. That's not leadership. That's anarchy." Lyric stood. "Sir, I'm not arguing against the chain of command. I'm arguing against using classification as a weapon to silence people who've done nothing wrong. There's a difference." Kellerman studied her. For a moment, she thought he might actually agree. Then his expression hardened again. "You're dismissed, Captain. Return to your quarters. You're restricted to base pending a formal review of today's events." "Yes, sir." Lyric saluted and left. As she walked down the hallway, she could feel the weight of everything settling on her shoulders. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But at least now, it was a fight she could see. She made her way back to the barracks, a low concrete building on the edge of the base. Her quarters were small, functional. A bed, a desk, a locker, everything she owned fit in 2 duffel bags. That was the way she liked it. No attachments, no complications, everything portable. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out her phone. 3 missed calls, 2 from numbers she didn't recognize, 1 from a contact labeled simply as Sierra. She stared at that last one for a long moment. Then she put the phone away without listening to any of the messages. There was a knock at the door. Lyric stood, opened it, and found Decker standing in the hallway, still in his grease-stained coveralls. "Ma'am, thought you should know. The pilots are gathering at the O Club tonight. Word is they want to talk to you." "About what?" "About what happened, about the mission, about what comes next." Decker's expression was neutral, but his eyes held something that looked like approval. "Might be good for morale, yours and theirs." Lyric considered it. She was restricted to base anyway, and facing the pilots now might be better than letting the speculation build. "What time?" 1900 hours, ma'am." "I'll think about it." Decker nodded and left. Lyric closed the door and sat back down on the bed. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. In 6 hours, she'd have to decide whether to face the squadron or stay isolated. She already knew what she'd choose. Isolation had protected her for 14 weeks. It had also nearly destroyed her. If you've ever had to choose between silence and truth, between protection and principle, share this story. And if you believe some voices deserve to be heard no matter the cost, consider subscribing. What happened that evening would prove that vindication and acceptance were not the same thing. The Officers' Club sat on the western edge of Falcon Ridge Air Station, a low building with windows that faced the desert and caught the last light of every sunset. By 1900 hours, the sky had turned the color of burning copper, and shadows stretched long across the sand. Lyric stood outside the entrance, her hand on the door handle, listening to the low murmur of voices inside. She'd changed out of her flight suit into standard duty uniform, clean, pressed, professional, but her boots still carried dust from the tarmac, and her hands still smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel. Some things didn't wash off easily. The door opened before she could push it. Decker stood there, a beer in one hand, his weathered face creased into something that might have been encouragement. "They're waiting, ma'am." Lyric stepped inside. The room fell silent immediately. 40 pilots turned to look at her. They filled every table, every chair, standing along the walls where seating had run out. Gareth and Inez near the bar. Sable at a corner table with 3 other Apache pilots. DeSoto standing near the windows, his arms crossed, watching. Even a few crew chiefs had shown up, Decker among them, positioned near the back like they were ready to witness something important. Lyric stopped just inside the doorway. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched out, heavy with expectation. Then Gareth stood. His chair scraped against the floor. He didn't say anything. Just stood there, looking at her with an expression that held equal parts respect and shame. Inez stood next, then Sable, then the pilot beside her. One by one, the entire room rose to their feet. Not at attention, not saluting, just standing. A quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than any formal ceremony. Lyric felt something catch in her throat. She nodded once, a small gesture that encompassed the whole room. "Please sit," she said quietly. They sat. But the atmosphere had changed. The uncertainty that had surrounded her for weeks was gone, replaced by something else. Something that felt almost like acceptance. Sable spoke first, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "Ma'am, I think I speak for most of us when I say we owe you an explanation for how you were treated. You don't owe me anything. With respect, ma'am, we do." Sable glanced around the room, gathering support from the faces watching her. "We made assumptions. We listened to whispers instead of waiting for facts. We should have known better." A pilot named Corvin, a stocky man from Oregon who flew close air support, leaned forward. The rumors spread fast: psych eval, disciplinary action, insubordination. None of us questioned them because it seemed easier to believe Command knew something we didn't. "Command did know something you didn't," Lyric said. "They just chose not to share it." "That's not an excuse," Inez said quietly. "We're supposed to trust our wingmen. We're supposed to give each other the benefit of the doubt. We didn't do that for you." Lyric moved to an empty chair someone had pulled out for her. She sat, and the room seemed to relax slightly. "You want honesty?" she asked. Heads nodded around the room. "Then here it is. You did what any rational person would do. You saw someone get pulled from a high-profile mission with no explanation, and you filled in the blanks with the most logical answer. Command doesn't trust her, so maybe we shouldn't either. That's not weakness. That's human nature." "But it was wrong," Sable said. "It was incomplete information." Lyric's voice was firm, but not unkind. "The failure wasn't yours. It was the system that put me in that position. That put all of us in that position." DeSoto spoke from his position near the windows. "The system that uses classification as a shield instead of a tool." Lyric glanced at him. He met her eyes with an expression that said he understood more than most. "Yes, sir. Exactly that." Gareth cleared his throat. "Ma'am, what Admiral Renfield said today, the Qatar Basin, that was real?" "Yes." "Can you talk about it?" Lyric was quiet for a moment. The room held its breath. "Limited details. The mission's still classified, but the Admiral made the core facts public. So I'll tell you what I can. She leaned back in her chair, organizing her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on a different quality. Not the clipped precision of a briefing, but the measured tone of someone recounting something that still lived close to the surface. 14 weeks ago, I was flying solo patrol in a region I can't name. Standard reconnaissance. No contact expected. Then I got an emergency beacon from a ground team that had been ambushed during a separate operation. They were pinned down, taking fire from multiple positions. Their exfil was compromised. No backup within range except me. The room was absolutely silent now. Even the background noise from the kitchen had stopped. I had two choices: follow protocol, request clearance, and wait for authorization that would take too long, or go in immediately and deal with the consequences later. You went in, Corvin said. I went in. The terrain was urban, narrow streets, buildings on both sides, perfect ambush territory. I took fire from 3 different positions before I even reached the team's location. RPGs, small arms. One round went through the tail section and missed the fuel line by inches. Sable's eyes were wide. How did you neutralize 3 positions while extracting personnel? Carefully. Lyric's tone held the ghost of dark humor, and with a lot of ammunition. I suppressed 2 positions with cannon fire, took out the 3rd with a hellfire. The ground team used the opening to get to the extraction point. I landed under fire, they loaded, and we got out. With 11% fuel, Inez said, repeating what Renfield had told them. Yes, and critical damage to both engines. The bird was flyable, but just barely. We made it back to base on fumes and prayers. Decker spoke from the back of the room, his gravelly voice cutting through. I saw the damage report on that bird before it was classified. Whoever flew it back shouldn't have made it. The hydraulics were shot. The tail rotor was compromised. One engine was running on 40% capacity. It was a good bird, Lyric said simply. She held together. The bird held together because you knew how to fly her, Decker countered. There's a difference. Lyric didn't argue. She just looked down at her hands, calloused and scarred from years of work that left marks. A younger pilot named Thane, barely 25, with the kind of eagerness that hadn't been worn down yet, leaned forward. Ma'am, why did they scrub your record? If the mission was successful, if you saved lives, why bury it? Because the mission wasn't supposed to happen. The ground team wasn't supposed to be in that region. My patrol wasn't supposed to be there either. When everything went wrong simultaneously, it raised questions about operational planning, about intelligence failures, about authorization chains. So they blamed you, Thane said, his voice edged with anger. They didn't blame anyone. They just decided the easiest solution was to make the whole thing disappear. Classify it so deeply that nobody could ask questions. And you, DeSoto added from the windows. They classified you too. Lyric met his eyes. Yes, sir. That's exactly what they did. The room processed that in silence. Finally, Sable spoke again, her voice careful. Ma'am, how did you deal with it? Knowing what you'd done and not being able to tell anyone? Lyric considered the question. It was the first time anyone had asked her that directly. I didn't deal with it well, she said honestly. I tried to bury it the way they told me to. Tried to move forward like nothing had happened. But every time someone looked at me sideways, every time I heard whispers in the hallway, it got harder. Because I knew what I'd done, and I knew it was worth something. But I couldn't defend myself without breaking classification. That's why you didn't fight the grounding, Inez said, understanding dawning on her face. That's why. Fighting it would have required explaining why I deserved to fly, and I couldn't do that without exposing the mission. But the Admiral could, Corvin said. Yes, he had the authority to declassify what he needed to declassify. I didn't. Gareth shook his head slowly. That's the most messed up catch-22 I've ever heard. It's the military, Lyric said with a slight shrug. We don't get to choose which rules make sense. A crew chief named Pharaoh, a woman who'd been working the flight line for 20 years, spoke up from near the bar. Ma'am, I watched you fly today. That wasn't just skill. That was muscle memory from being in situations where skill alone doesn't cut it. How many times have you been in the fire? Lyric was quiet for a moment. Enough to know what it costs, and enough to know it's worth paying. The conversation shifted after that. Questions became less about the mission and more about flying, about decision-making under pressure, about how to maintain composure when everything was falling apart. Lyric answered what she could, deflected what she couldn't, and slowly the atmosphere in the room transformed from interrogation to something closer to mentorship. By the time the sun had fully set and the desert darkness pressed against the windows, the conversation had fractured into smaller groups, pilots comparing notes, crew chiefs discussing maintenance philosophies. Lyric found herself at a table, with Sable, DeSoto, and a few others, talking about the psychological challenges of combat flying. Sable was the one who finally asked the question that had been hovering unspoken all evening. "Ma'am, what happens now? With the Admiral's revelation, with Kellerman, with all of it?" Lyric took a sip of water, buying herself a moment to think. "Honestly, I don't know. There will be inquiries, probably a formal review. Kellerman's already restricted me to base pending investigation." "Investigation of what?" DeSoto's voice held an edge. "You followed a direct order from a 4-star admiral. Investigation of whether the admiral had authority to declassify that information without proper channels, whether there were security breaches, whether anyone needs to be held accountable." "They're looking for a scapegoat," Sable said flatly. "Maybe. Or maybe they're just trying to contain the damage. Either way, I'll cooperate with whatever they need." "And if they try to bury you again?" Lyric met Sable's eyes. "Then I'll deal with it. Same as I dealt with it before. But this time, people know the truth. That changes things." DeSoto nodded slowly. "It does. Because now it's not just your word. It's the Admiral's, and he's not someone they can easily silence." The conversation continued for another hour, but eventually people started filtering out. Early flights tomorrow, maintenance schedules, the regular rhythm of military life reasserting itself. Lyric stayed until the end, talking with the last few pilots who lingered, answering questions, accepting apologies she hadn't asked for, but seemed to mean something to the people offering them. When she finally left the O Club, the desert night had turned cold. The temperature dropped fast out here once the sun went down. Lyric walked slowly across the compound, her breath visible in the air, her mind turning over everything that had happened. The barracks were quiet when she arrived. Most people were already asleep or close to it. She let herself into her quarters and sat on the edge of the bed, not bothering to turn on the lights. The darkness felt appropriate somehow, restful. Her phone buzzed, a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Formal inquiry scheduled for 0800 tomorrow. Pentagon liaison will be present. Bring documentation for all flights in the last 6 months. Colonel Hendricks, JAG." Lyric stared at the message, so it was starting. The official response. The bureaucratic machinery grinding into motion. She set the phone aside and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, for the first time in 14 weeks, she felt like she could breathe. She slept better than she had in months. The next morning arrived with the same brutal desert sun that had marked every day at Falcon Ridge. Lyric was awake before dawn, running through her pre-inquiry checklist. Documentation organized, flight logs printed, after-action reports from every sortie, in the last 6 months compiled into a single binder. Everything they could possibly ask for, ready and accessible. The inquiry was held in the base conference room, a windowless space with fluorescent lighting and a long table that had seen 1,000 meetings just like this one. Lyric arrived 15 minutes early and found Colonel Hendricks already there, a stern woman in her 50s with JAG insignia and an expression that gave nothing away. "Captain Castellane, ma'am, have a seat. We're waiting for 2 more participants." Lyric sat. The minutes ticked by in silence. Then the door opened and Admiral Renfield walked in, followed by a civilian in a dark suit who introduced himself as Marcus Webb from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. The inquiry lasted 4 hours. They went through everything, the Qatar Basin mission in exhaustive detail, the decision-making process, the classification protocols, the Admiral's authority to declassify, Lyric's conduct before, during, and after the revelation. They asked the same questions multiple ways, probing for inconsistencies, testing her memory, verifying every detail. Lyric answered everything with the same calm precision she'd use for a pre-flight briefing. Facts, timelines, decisions, consequences, no embellishment, no defensiveness, just the truth, as clearly as she could state it. Renfield's presence changed the dynamic. Every time Webb or Hendricks started to push into territory that felt like entrapment, Renfield would interject with a clarification or a procedural point that redirected the conversation. He wasn't protecting her exactly. He was ensuring the process stayed fair. By noon, Hendricks closed her notebook. "Captain, based on this review, I find no evidence of misconduct on your part. You followed lawful orders from a superior officer with appropriate authority. The classification decisions were made above your level. Your conduct throughout has been consistent with military standards." Lyric felt something release in her chest. "Thank you, ma'am. However," Hendricks continued, "there will be ongoing review of the classification protocols and the decision chain that led to the initial suppression of your record. That's not your concern, but you should be aware it's happening." "Understood, ma'am." Webb spoke for the first time in an hour. "Captain, off the record. What you did in the Qatar Basin was extraordinary. The fact that it was buried for political convenience is a failure of the system, not of you. I want you to know that." Lyric nodded. "I appreciate that, sir." The inquiry ended. Renfield walked out with her, down the hallway and out into the midday heat. "You did well in there," he said. "I just told the truth, sir. The truth delivered poorly can still cause damage. You delivered it well." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Captain, I want you to understand something. What happened to you was wrong. The system failed you. I can't undo that, but I can. Make sure it doesn't happen again." "Sir, I'm recommending you for a commendation, retroactive to the Qatar Basin operation. It won't be public, the mission details are still classified, but it will be in your official record, and I'm personally ensuring that your flight status is unrestricted going forward." Lyric didn't know what to say. "Sir, I don't need recognition. I just need to fly." "You'll do both, because you've earned both." Renfield's expression softened slightly. "And Captain, between us, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen a lot of pilots. You're one of the best I've encountered. Don't let bureaucracy convince you otherwise." He left before she could respond. Lyric stood alone in the sun, processing words she'd never expected to hear from someone at that level. The rest of the day passed in a blur of administrative tasks, updating records, filing reports, dealing with the endless paperwork that followed any official inquiry. By evening, Lyric was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. She was heading back to her quarters when she passed the flight line. The Apaches sat in their rows, exactly as they always did, but one of them caught her eye. Apache 6-1, her bird, still marked with the maintenance tags from yesterday's flight. Decker was there, running his evening inspection. He glanced up as she approached. "Evening, ma'am." "Decker, how's she looking?" "Perfect, as always." He wiped his hands on a rag. "Heard the inquiry went well." News traveled fast on a military base. "It did. Cleared of any misconduct." "Good. Would have been a crime if it went the other way." Decker gestured at the Apache. "She missed you, I think." "The bird. Flies different when you're in the seat." Lyric ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the smooth metal under her palm. There was a patch near the tail section, new paint, clean welds, the repair from the Qatar Basin damage that officially never happened. "Decker, you knew, didn't you, about the mission?" "Suspected. When they brought this bird in for repairs and classified the whole thing, I knew something major had happened. And when you came back different, quieter, I figured you'd been in something that changed you. Why didn't you say anything?" "Wasn't my place. And you didn't need someone else asking questions you couldn't answer." He folded the rag and tucked it into his belt. "But I never doubted you, ma'am, not for a second." Lyric felt that tightness in her chest again. "Thank you, Decker. That means more than you know." He nodded once, then went back to his inspection. Lyric stood there for a moment longer, her hand on the Apache, feeling the connection to the machine that had carried her through fire and brought her home. Then she walked back to her quarters as the desert sun began its descent toward the horizon. 3 days later, the official notifications came through. The restriction on her movement was lifted. Her flight status was confirmed as unrestricted, and buried in the administrative language was a note that a classified commendation had been added to her service record. The whispers on base had changed too. Not gone, whispers never fully disappeared in a military environment, but transformed. Now, when people talked about Lyric Castellane, it was with respect, sometimes awe. The woman who flew the mission nobody could talk about. The pilot who got grounded and then vindicated by a 4-star admiral in front of the entire base. She became something of a legend without wanting to be one. A week after the inquiry, Lyric was assigned to lead a training exercise for new Apache pilots. 6 young officers fresh from flight school, eager and terrified in equal measure. She spent 3 days walking them through advanced maneuvers, emergency protocols, and the kind of decision-making that couldn't be taught in a classroom. On the final day, after a successful training sortie, one of the new pilots, a young woman named Cisco, approached her on the tarmac. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do you handle it? The pressure, the knowledge that people are counting on you to be perfect." Lyric considered the question. It was one she'd been asked before, but it never got easier to answer. You don't handle it by being perfect. You handle it by being prepared, by knowing your equipment, by training until the right responses are automatic, and by accepting that you'll make mistakes and learning from them when you do. "But you are perfect, ma'am. Everyone says so. The way you fly, the way you handle the bird, it's flawless." Lyric shook her head. "I'm not perfect, Cisco. I'm just experienced. And experience comes from making every possible mistake and surviving long enough to learn from them." She gestured at the Apache behind them. "This machine is incredible, but it's just metal and hydraulics and electronics. What makes it effective is the person in the cockpit. And that person doesn't need to be perfect. They just need to be committed to the mission, to their crew, to getting the job done no matter what." Cisco nodded slowly. "The Qatar Basin. Is that what you're talking about?" "Among other things, but yes. That mission went wrong in about 10 different ways. I made mistakes, the planning was flawed, the intelligence was incomplete, but I was committed to bringing those people home, and that commitment mattered more than perfection." "How do you live with the mistakes?" "By using them to get better, by making sure the next mission goes smoother, because I learned from what went wrong before." Lyric met the younger pilot's eyes. "The key isn't avoiding failure, Cisco. It's making sure your failures don't cost lives, and that comes from preparation, training, and never assuming you know everything." Cisco saluted. "Thank you, ma'am. That helps." As she walked away, Lyric felt a shift inside herself. For weeks, she'd been the victim of classification, the pilot who'd been silenced. But now, standing on this tarmac watching new pilots learn, she realized she'd become something else. She'd become the example, not of perfection, of perseverance. That evening, Lyric returned to the empty briefing room where this had all started. The roster board was updated with new assignments. Her name was back on the active flight list, lead pilot for the next major exercise, the position she'd earned through years of work and one mission that had nearly cost her everything. She stood there for a long time, looking at that roster board, thinking about the path that had led here. The door opened behind her. Sable stepped in, hesitated when she saw Lyric, then approached. "Ma'am, didn't expect anyone to be here. Just checking the schedule." Sable looked at the roster board. "You're leading the next exercise. Apparently. You deserve it." Sable's voice was firm. "After everything, you deserve that and more." Lyric turned to face her. "Sable, can I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am. When you found out the truth about the Qatar Basin, about why I was really grounded, how did it change how you saw things?" Sable was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It made me realize how much we don't know, how many people around us might be carrying things we can't see. And it made me understand that the absence of explanation isn't the same as the absence of reason." "That's a good answer. It's an honest one." Sable paused. "Ma'am, for what it's worth, I'm glad the truth came out. Not just for you, for all of us. Because now we know that silence doesn't always mean guilt. Sometimes it just means the story is bigger than we're allowed to see." Lyric nodded. "Thank you, Sable." After Sable left, Lyric stayed in the briefing room for a while longer. The building was empty now, quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of jets on evening patrol. She thought about the last few weeks, the humiliation of being grounded, the whispers, the isolation. The moment Admiral Renfield had spoken 5 words that changed everything: the inquiry, the vindication, the slow rebuilding of relationships that had been fractured by incomplete information. None of it had been easy. None of it had been fair. But all of it had been necessary. She walked out of the briefing room and across the darkening base. The desert night was settling in, cold and clear. Above, stars were beginning to emerge, bright and sharp in the pollution-free sky. When she reached her quarters, there was a package waiting outside her door. No return address, no note. Just a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a single item, a unit patch, the kind that wasn't supposed to exist. Black background, silver Apache silhouette. And beneath it, 4 words in crimson thread. Qatar Basin. Shadow flight. Classified. Someone had made this. Someone who knew what happened. Someone who wanted her to have a physical reminder that the whole mission, even if officially buried, mattered. Lyric held the patch in her hand, feeling the weight of embroidered fabric and everything it represented. She didn't know who'd sent it. Probably never would. But she understood the message. You were there. It happened. It mattered. She set the patch on her desk, next to her flight logs and the documentation from the inquiry. A small piece of evidence that the silence had been broken, even if the full story would never be public. That night, she slept with the window open, letting the desert cold seep into the room. She'd grown up in places where cold meant something different, where winter brought snow and ice instead of just a drop in temperature. But this cold felt right somehow. Clean, honest. The next morning, she was back in the cockpit of Apache 6-1, running a routine patrol that was anything but routine because it was the first flight after everything had changed. The bird responded to her touch with the familiar precision that came from hundreds of hours together. As she flew over the desert, watching the sun climb into a sky so blue it hurt to look at, Lyric thought about what came next. More missions, more training, more opportunities to prove that the Admiral's faith in her wasn't misplaced, but also more challenges, more classification decisions, more moments where she'd have to choose between speaking and staying silent. The difference now was that she knew the cost of both choices, and she knew she could survive either one. The radio crackled, tower requesting her position. She reported in, received confirmation, and continued her patrol pattern. Below, the desert stretched out forever, empty, beautiful, unforgiving, like the career she'd chosen, like the path she'd walked, like the future that was still unwritten. She banked the Apache into a turn, feeling the machine respond instantly, and headed back toward base. When she landed an hour later, Decker was waiting with his clipboard and his eternal inspection routine. He didn't comment on the flight, didn't ask how it felt to be back in the air without restrictions, just did his job with the same meticulous care he always showed. But when Lyric climbed out of the cockpit, he glanced up and gave her a small nod. That was enough. She walked across the tarmac toward the operations building, her flight suit stained with sweat, her body tired in the good way that came from work well done. Other pilots nodded as she passed. Crew chiefs called out greetings. The base had returned to its normal rhythm, but she was no longer outside that rhythm. She was part of it again. In the operations office, new assignments were being posted. Training schedules, deployment rotations, the endless cycle of military planning. Her name appeared on multiple lists now. Lead pilot, training officer, mission coordinator. The silence that had nearly destroyed her was gone, but it had been replaced by something equally challenging: visibility, responsibility, the expectation that she would continue to be exceptional now that everyone knew what she was capable of. It was a different kind of pressure, but it was one she'd trained for her entire career. She filed her after-action report from the morning patrol, checked the schedule for tomorrow's flights, and headed back to her quarters. Evening was approaching again, the cycle continuing. As she walked past the command tower, she saw Admiral Renfield's black Suburban pulling out through the main gate. He was leaving, mission accomplished, truth revealed, system corrected, at least partially. She wondered if she'd ever see him again. Probably not. 4-star admirals didn't typically maintain relationships with captains, but his intervention had changed everything, and for that, she'd be grateful for the rest of her career. The sun was setting as she reached her quarters. She paused outside, looking back at the flight line one more time. The Apaches sat in their rows, ready for whatever tomorrow brought. She thought about the patch hidden in her desk drawer, about the mission that officially never happened, about the silence she'd carried for 14 weeks, and the 5 words that had broken it. And she thought about what came next: more missions, more challenges, more moments where she'd have to choose between comfort and truth. But now, at least, she knew she didn't have to make those choices alone. If you know someone who's carried weight in silence, whose story deserves to be told but never was, honor them by sharing this. And if you believe in the power of truth over comfortable lies, consider joining us here. Some battles are fought in the open, others happen in silence. Both deserve recognition.